Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. If you enjoy what we do, you can support the Society by becoming a member today. Please visit our online bookstore and our eBay store online. Links below.
All right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's Money Talks, and really appreciate you coming because for many of us, at least here in New York, it's a gorgeous day. So why you would give up such a gorgeous day to come listen to me talk, I don't know, but I certainly, welcome your participation in this. So I'll just preface this by saying, this is a topic that I've been interested in for a while. I'm obviously not a specialist in US history or US coinage. I have over the years developed a lot of interest in the Dalek art, and I've published a fair amount on that. And I did years ago start to develop an interest in expositions, 19th century expositions, particularly when working on an exhibit at the then Federal Reserve exhibit space that we had on the 2004 Olympics. We did an exhibit in conjunction with that, and then I published a catalog, in conjunction with that, and that really spurred a lot of interest that has developed over the years in expositions. But this particular exposition, the 1893 Columbian Exposition, I really find fascinating for all sorts of reasons. There's, as I'll discuss, but the numismatic component, as many of you already know, is really quite interesting as well. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so I can pull up my PowerPoint, and then we'll get rolling. Oops. I don't think that's what we want to see. Pull up that and see. So can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir. It's not on full screen yet, but it's there.
I'll put that on full screen. There we go. How's that?
Looks great.
All right. So there's a statue of Christopher Columbus that stands inside Central Park, created by the Spanish sculptor Jerónimo Suñol, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. At this very moment, the statue has a barricade around it and 24/7 police protection to prevent vandalism, much like that which was done to the statue in 2017. The current barricade and police protection have been there since last summer, when in the course of the George Floyd protests, numerous statues of previously revered figures in US and European history were vandalized or pulled down across the country. Let's see if that, I have to use that control. All right. In Baltimore, for example, a statue of Christopher Columbus was pulled down by protesters on Independence Day last year and tossed into the inner harbor. That Columbus is an object of ire is nothing new. For decades now, tensions have developed around the reality of Columbus, both as the harbinger of European imperialism and the genocide and destruction of pre-Columbian native peoples and cultures, including his own personal role in the slavery and murder of native Caribbean peoples, and also the symbolism of Columbus, not just of Euro-American progress, but more poignantly as a symbol of pride for Italian Americans. Attempts to convert the national holiday Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day haven't gained significant traction, at least not yet. And following New York City Mayor de Blasio's call to review all of the city's statuary last year to identify symbols of hate for removal, the Columbus monument standing in the center of Columbus Circle, which was also barricaded and protected by the police around the clock until just a month ago, was deemed worthy of still keeping, with the National Park Service even adding it to the National Register of Historic Places. So clearly, Columbus still has a long way to go on his walk into the shadows of ill repute. Today, however, I am much less concerned with the appraisal of Columbus in the 21st century than I am with his appraisal at the end of the 19th century, when much of Columbus's veneration in the US gelled in the events leading up to and surrounding one of the largest and most important spectacles ever to take place in the United States, the world's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago for 6 months in 1893. And ironically, in many ways, the Columbian Exposition had much less to do with Columbus and his so-called discovery of America than it did with the American people showcasing their accomplishments on the cusp of the 20th century, not just to themselves, but more importantly, to the rest of the world. Columbus, for all intents and purposes, was just a convenient excuse. Indeed, the monumental statue of Columbus erected at the Exposition was not as conspicuously placed or as long-lasting as Daniel Chester French's massive 100-foot tall golden statue of the Republic, erected at one end of the lagoon, and a smaller replica of this still exists today in Chicago, which faced another statue group depicting Liberty rowed in a galley at the opposite end of the lagoon. By most measures, except for the numismatics, as we'll soon see, the Columbian Exposition was a resounding success. By the time the exposition closed 6 months after it opened in May 1893, over 21 million people had passed through the turnstiles to see the 65,000 exhibits presented by each of the states and territories of the US, as well as by 47 participating nations. A number of the exhibits unveiled new products that were to become American staples, such as Cracker Jacks, cream of wheat, and Aunt Jemima pancake mix. And thankfully, the original packaging of these last two has been revised in recent years. And it was also at the fair as well that Pabst beer earned its famed blue ribbon. So in some ways, the legacy of the fair still lives on today, nearly 130 years later. Many of the exhibits were housed in large themed buildings, such as the Agriculture Building or Transportation Building surrounding the Central Lagoon, all of which were designed by some of the best architects in the US and adorned with sculptures from leading artists. With few exceptions, none of these buildings were meant to last, having been constructed of impermanent materials, as was much of the statuary. Within a year or so after the gates were closed, most of this was in ruins. Additional exhibits were housed in smaller buildings designed and built by representatives from each state or country, some of which imported the materials and the workmen to complete them. Adjacent to the cultural heart of the exhibition was the Midway Plaisance, featuring entertainments of various sorts, some a little risque, including a replica of a Cairo street and the world's first Ferris wheel. In addition to the exhibits and entertainments, numerous scientific, medical, and other academic congresses were held, including one in which Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a paper on his now famous frontier thesis of American history. And special trains ran from New York to Chicago to accommodate the demand for those traveling to see the exposition. This was a once-in-a-lifetime event and something certainly not to be missed. Now, what I've found particularly intriguing in my research on the exposition is the number of fault lines that the preparations and presentations of the fair exposed in late 19th century US society, politics, and even economics. These include, for example, the considerable tensions between Native Americans and those seeking manifest destiny, between American-born nativists and those still immigrating from across the seas, between various immigrant groups themselves, between the global-oriented East Coast and internally-oriented heartland, between Democrats and Republicans, between artists and artisans, between pro-silver and pro-gold currency reformers, and perhaps even more fundamentally, between men and women. It is these tensions, or at least some of them, that I'd like to explore here today, and how, at least in some instances, they found expression in the numismatic material associated with the exposition, of which there is a considerable amount, and a good deal of this is at the ANS, and it appears mostly in the forms of medals and tokens, which were usefully cataloged about half a century ago by Nathan Eaglet, and it also includes the very first commemorative US coins. So to begin, let's look at the origins of the exposition. The first exposition in the US was held in New York City in 1853, an attempt to mimic the success of the British Great Exposition held just a couple of years before, including the New York organizers' own version of the famed British Crystal Palace. The New York exhibition was a success and whetted the appetite for more. But it would be nearly 20 years before the next major exposition in the US would be organized. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, held in 1876, which was considered a large and really rather well organized event, and which demonstrated more than anything else how the US was coming along in its recovery and reconstruction after the Civil War. Already in the mid-1880s, there were murmurs, especially among Italian Americans, of celebrating the quadricentennial of Columbus's first voyage on a grand scale. Excuse me. But it was the resounding success of the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, where the Eiffel Tower was unveiled, that provided the catalyst to organize an American exposition on an equally grand scale to show the old world that the new world was now its equal in every regard. As one New York Times article in October 1892 put it, quote, "Thus has the new world already reacted upon the old, and every educated and discerning man in every country knows that the Europeanization of America, which Columbus began, is surely and inevitably to be followed by the Americanization of Europe," unquote. This was the moment to seize, and the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage was all the pretext that those in Washington needed to establish a senatorial committee to spur the organization of a major American exposition and to appropriate federal funding to make it happen. The first task, however, was to decide which city would host it. And there were four major competitors: New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. And to most observers, the honor seemed New York's for the taking. While the Senate committee was requiring $5 million in pledges from the potential host, raised from each city's wealthiest citizens, New York was able to get pledges for $15 million. But as the process and hearings continued, political backbiting in New York began to get in the way. Sound familiar? Particularly between the Democratic powers in Tammany Hall and the Republicans in the state Senate. Eventually, New York's bid fell apart over the inability of the warring factions to agree on the required state-level legislation. And there were as well the Chicago delegation's arguments that New York was simply out of touch with the rest of the country. And it was, in effect, an old world city ill-suited to host an American fair. As the Chicago Tribune crowed, their victory was due to the quote-unquote deadly provincialism of New York. The city had failed, quote, to look over the Alleghenies to see that there was anything there or to understand that those who lived beyond those mountains had any rights, unquote. This aroused against New York Fair proponents the, quote, indignation of 20 million who lived in the valley of the great river of the West and its tributaries. And as a result, the people of the Mississippi Valley resolved that the narrow-minded city on the eastern seaboard should be put through a course of educational sprouts and be taught that it could no longer dictate to Congress as it once did, unquote. Holding the fair in the West would enable visitors from the East to, continuing, quote, to learn that there were people living on this side of the Alleghenies whose acquaintance was worth cultivating, because the scepter had passed into their hands, unquote. Ouch. New York papers in response shrugged off the loss and pretended not to care, at least for a while. So with Chicago now, it's the decided host, it was time to start building. The organization of the Columbian Exposition, established by Congress in 1890, called for a national commission to supervise the enterprise and for a board of lady managers to organize women's participation in the fair. Each governor nominated 2 representatives and 2 alternates to the National Commission. The commissioners in turn nominated 2 women and their alternates to serve on the board of lady managers. In every state and territory, the representatives to each body were equally divided between the Democratic and Republican parties. The Board of Lady Managers, led by Bertha Palmer, a Chicago socialite, was to prove a continual thorn in the side of the gentleman managers, but they were permitted a sizable building of their own to exhibit the contributions of women to the progress of society and civilization. One of the overarching concerns of those organizing the fair was that it be a showcase of American architecture and art, to demonstrate that American architects and artists were equal to their European counterparts. Chicago architect Daniel Burnham was made director of works and began to assemble committees to hire leading architects and artists who could set standards of excellence and assure cultural respectability. Augustus St. Gaudens, already recognized as one of the leading sculptors of his generation, was soon involved, who offered a list of young American-born but European-trained sculptors to fulfill Burnham's vision. St. Gaudens is reported to have said that one of Burnham's subsequent planning sessions for the exposition constituted the greatest meeting of artistic minds since the Renaissance. In assembling the artists, the workers, and the materials to build the Grand White City around Frederick Law Olmsted's lagoon, no expense was spared, as this series of tokens emphasizes, which record not just images of the individual buildings and their sizes, but also the outlandish amount of money spent on structures not meant to last more than a year. And that huge outlay, as it turned out, was a huge problem. In the end, the cost of building the exposition was over $30 million, or close to $1 billion today, adjusted for inflation. Originally, the Senate committee estimated the cost of hosting the exposition at around $5 million. With that amount pledged from the Chicago organizers, things seemed on track for a brief moment until further reviews of mounting and projected expenses associated with paying the thousands of artists and laborers building the exposition made it clear that this would fall well short of what was needed. Rather than appropriating still more millions outright, a bill was presented to Congress that would ultimately create the US's first commemorative coin as a means of offsetting some of the costs. Although struck with a 50-cent face value, the coin would be sold as a souvenir for $1. The proceeds going to the World Columbian Exposition Corporation, overseeing the construction and management of the fair. Controversy surrounded this coin from the beginning, as has been well documented by several researchers, notably Q. David Bowers, David Provost, Mike Moran, and others. Arguments from both sides of the congressional aisle hammered on their objections to such a program, which included, among other things, offense at having the public employees at the mint making something to milk profits from the public. Even once the bill was approved and signed into law by President Harrison, it was still unclear to many concerned, including the editors of the American Journal of Numismatics, or AJN, which still is the Society's journal, if this coin was intended to be currency or just a souvenir. In the end, it was both. Initially, it was offered only as a souvenir, one marketed as something of an investment to those willing to buy it, until its poor sales compelled the Secretary of the Treasury to release some 1.5 million of them into circulation after the exposition was over, thereby enraging those who had, in fact, bought them for the 100% markup. Equally contentious was the coin's design, which the editors of the AJN called, quote unquote, a great disappointment, lamenting that there was a missed opportunity with this souvenir to create something reflecting the potential of American numismatic art. Now, this lamentable art had in part its origins just 2 years before, in 1891, the year the US Mint solicited designs from outside artists to revamp its subsidiary silver coinage. Now, while the Mint's intentions might have been good, its execution failed badly. A group of 11 leading artists, mostly from New York, including Augustus St. Gaudens, collectively wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury and Director of the Mint, indicating that the 6 weeks to submit the design was too short and the $500 offered for a successful design too little. All of them refused to submit. St. Gaudens did, however, eventually sit on the committee with U.S. Mint Chief Engraver Charles Barber to review the hundreds of designs submitted, none of which were selected, in part because of an emerging feud between St. Gaudens and Barber over what would make a successful coin design. And in the end, it was Barber, the long-serving chief engraver, who designed the new coinage, which was widely panned. Shortly after the new coinage was released, a reporter from Harper's Weekly sought comments from St. Gaudens, who derided the design, saying, quote, "There are 100 men who could have done very much better than this. This is inept. This looks like it had been designed by a young lady of 16, a miss who had taken only a few lessons in modeling. It is beneath criticism, beneath contempt," unquote. Additional comments from another sculptor, Jonathan Scott Hartley, noted that Barber's rendition of Liberty looked like, quote, "a disreputable woman just recovering from a prolonged debauch," unquote. While Kenyon Cox remarked that, quote, "it is disgraceful that a great country should have such a coin as this," unquote. If anything, such comments seem to have steeled Barber in a growing battle between him, the professional coin engraver, and the lofty artists, who didn't have a clue, it must have seemed to him, in what creating a practical coin design meant. The basis of the design for the Columbian $50 was, in fact, a metal designed for other purposes at the fair by Olin Levy Warner, who tragically died in a bicycling accident in Central Park just a few years later in 1896. Barber effectively stole Warner's portrait without giving credit, and in doing so toned down much of Warner's remarkable and subtle modeling, as you can see in the slide. But perhaps it was for the best that Barber took full credit, since he suffered full blame for its failures on the souvenir coin. Bertha Palmer, meanwhile, and the board of lady managers also took notice of Barber's less than exquisite rendering and sought to do better, endeavoring to create the US's first truly beautiful coin as their own souvenir. Seeking to avoid congressional controversy, they waited until the next Congress, the 52nd, to petition for a bill for their own fundraising coin, one that would feature the Queen Isabella of Spain, Columbus's patron, and which would be designed by a woman. As the bill was working its way through Congress, Palmer approached the artist Carolyn Peddle, who began work on the commemorative quarter dollar in earnest. Soon after the bill was approved, however, Peddle resigned in frustration from the project as it became, increasingly clear that the powers that be in Washington and Philadelphia would rather someone else design the coin. And that someone else was, of course, Charles Barber. Once again, the editors of AJN had little good to say about Barber's work, drawing a comparison between the great work of the artists and architects in Chicago and the poor showing from a mint. Quote, "The contrast between the examples of the numismatic art of the nation as displayed on the Columbian coins on the one hand, and the spirited and admirable work of the architects on the buildings on the other is painful. If these two coins really represent the highest achievements of our medalists and mints, we might as well despair of the future," unquote. Barber's interference in the attempts by artists was far from over, however, and this time pitted the engraver directly against St. Gaudens, a saga that has been well documented by Thayer Toles and Mike Moran. The sculptor initially refused the offer to design the presentation medal that was to be awarded to all exhibitors, but ultimately relented, in part, as he was to admit, to keep it out of Barber's hands. The obverse design of the medal made reference to the monumental sculpture St. Gaudens intended to do for the fair, depicting Columbus coming ashore, work that was ultimately turned over to Mary Lawrence, one of his assistants, and who was ultimately given full credit for the statue. While the obverse of the medal was perfectly acceptable and raised no hackles, such was not the case for St. Gaudens' reverse, which depicted a nude youth representing the spirit of America. As sketches of the medal were leaked without St. Gaudens's permission, supersensitive minds, quote unquote, as the editors of the AJN put it in the Senate, took offense and put pressure on the Secretary of the Treasury to do away with the indecency. St. Gaudens, while not happy, was open to amending his design and ultimately submitted one that entirely erased the youth, which he was led to believe would be the reverse used. Unknown to him, however, Barber had also been asked to create a replacement, which was in fact the one selected to be used on the medals that were issued. St. Gaudens was rightly incensed and raged in the press, which had been following the story closely. To be forever linked in this way to Barber, a man and artisan whom he loathed, added insult to injury. As the finished medals finally began to be released 2.5 years after the fair closed, the editors of the AJN lamented once again that, quote, as specimens of the highest attainment of American numismatic art, the medal is hardly up to our hopes, unquote. In fact, during the course of the exposition, these same editors had been providing running commentary on the coins and medals produced in conjunction with the exposition, focusing primarily on the artwork, ever hopeful that this event would provide the stimulus needed for American artists and engravers to show the world that here in the US, we too could produce numismatic art on par with those found beyond our borders. For the most part, however, they were disappointed. Charles Nageley's medal, for example, they considered decidedly weak in technique and cannot be considered successful as a composition, unquote. Even the medal produced under the Society's own auspices, which had been designed by James Whitehouse, who had worked for Tiffany & Company for some 3 decades, received only the most mild praise and was criticized for what they considered to be an odd choice of words for the obverse inscription, noting that the use of humanity in light of Columbus's own actions towards indigenous peoples might be taken satirically. Of the dozens of medals to cross their desks, the only one that was worthy of the highest praise and esteem came from overseas and was created by Leah Alborn, a medallic artist employed by the Royal Mint in Stockholm, a medal they called, quote, one of the best productions of recent numismatic art, unquote. All told, for American numismatic art, the exposition was in fact a missed opportunity, one that would take another dozen years or so to rectify once the Medallic Art Company in New York got underway around 1903, and President Theodore Roosevelt sidelined Charles Barber in favor of St. Gaudens and other artists for a series of new coins introduced under his administration. The missed opportunity is made all the more poignant when compared to the great success artists and architects had with the White City in Chicago, demonstrating American artistic potential in a way never seen before. In fact, in the wake of the Mint's 1891 failure to engage outside artists, members of the American Numismatic Society sent a proposal to the Chicago Organizing Commission for a numismatic display of coins from all periods in order to show the public what good numismatic design looked like. Their proposal went unanswered, and in the end, the Society hosted its own successful exhibit in New York, thumbing their noses at those in Chicago. And in fact, there was a lot of that going on in New York around the time of the Chicago Exposition. Whatever initial indifference, feigned or not, there might have been on the part of New Yorkers to losing the honor of hosting the exposition to Chicago, this was soon to change, as more and more energy as well as funding was put into organizing a week-long celebration to be held in October 1892, almost half a year ahead of the delayed official opening of the Chicago Exposition. This celebration in New York, which included the unveiling of the Columbus Monument, attracted crowds larger than any such event in US history up to that moment, and possibly even to the present day. If anything, it certainly showed that the so-called foreign city on the coast was not going to concede an easy victory to the heartland. And indeed, much of the energy and support for the New York events came from the Italian American and Catholic populations, including a parade of 30,000 men, women, and children drawn from a number of Catholic schools and other organizations in the city. One high point of the celebrations that week was the unveiling of the Columbus Monument that stands in the center of Columbus Circle on 59th Street. The cost of building the 75-foot tall pedestal and statue, the work of the Italian artist Gaetano Russo, which had arrived in New York by ship just days before, was covered by contributions from the Italian-American community in New York. The inscription on the monument that begins, quote, "To Christopher Columbus, the Italians, residents in America, scoffed at before," unquote, underscores the symbolic desires of that community to gain respect and find equal footing as Americans. While a fair amount has been written about the Columbus Monument and its continuing symbolism, as well as the parades and religious ceremonies held that week, it was the Naval Review that took place in New York Harbor months later in April 1893, which inaugurated that year's Columbian celebrations, that has been mostly overlooked. From the standpoint of numismatics, this is in fact understandable, since there were not that many tokens produced to commemorate the review. Nevertheless, this was a momentous occasion, not just for New York City, but also for the imperial power that the US was on the cusp of becoming. To understand why, we need to back up for a moment and consider the status of the US Navy in the 1880s and 1890s. At the end of the Civil War, the US had the second largest and most powerful Navy in the world after the Royal Navy of Great Britain. By 1880, the US Navy had dropped to 12th place, behind even some South American navies, as Congress became increasingly preoccupied with westward expansion and was unwilling to fund a Navy for which it saw little need or purpose. A change of perception, brought about in part by German, British, and Spanish encroachments in the Americas, a violation of our self-proclaimed Monroe Doctrine, encouraged new spending to begin to modernize the fleet, to introduce a new steel Navy to replace the old wooden one. Funding for 3 new steel cruisers was authorized in 1883, reflecting the US naval doctrine at the time. In the event of war, the primary purpose of the Navy would be to protect US trade while disrupting the trade of the enemy. Cruisers were therefore the ideal type of warship, comparatively lightly armored and gunned, but able to cruise along alone at distances in search of enemy cargo ships. By the time of the Columbian Exposition, the first of the 1883 authorized cruisers had been in the water for just a few years, followed by a second generation of cruisers, and together these ships represented the US Navy's re-emergence from its decades-long slumber, which soon ignited an arms race with Germany to build the second most powerful Navy after the undisputed leader, the Royal Navy. In order to show off its new ships and nascent fleet maneuvering abilities, Congress authorized funds for a naval review similar to those sometimes hosted by the Royal Navy, but to be held at both Hampton Roads and in New York Harbor. And they sent out invitations to the world's navies to participate. While the response was mixed, those that truly counted, the British, the Germans, the French, and the Spanish, responded by sending their latest cruisers to parade up the Hudson River alongside the new cruisers of the US Navy. No such international parade of ships had ever taken place in the US before, and this certainly caught the eye of many illustrators and artists, including Frenchman Victor Perard, whose 4-foot-long fold-out views of the Naval Review appeared in special issues of Harper's Weekly. And this was, in fact, the first time that Harper's published such impressively large prints. Frederick Cozens, another New York-based artist, also produced chromolithographic views of the Naval Review that were part of a larger set that appeared in 1893, featuring ships, including many still under construction, that included the US Navy's first generation of battleships. Cozens' set of 24 prints seemed to have been part of a general push by the supporters of a new emerging naval doctrine that turned away from commerce raiding to control of the sea instead, which required heavily armed and armored battleships, not cruisers. And in order to drum up popular support for building more battleships, the US Navy sponsored the construction of a model battleship, the USS Illinois, a full-scale replica made of staff, not steel, of one of the Indiana-class ships then under construction. And this was set alongside a pier at the Exposition in Chicago, where it proved to be an enormously popular exhibit. As was, in fact, another set of replica ships, actual sailing replicas of the Santa Maria, Nina, and Pinta, Columbus's small fleet, as well as a replica of a Viking ship of the type Leif Erikson might have sailed to the New World hundreds of years before Columbus. Sponsored by the Norwegian government, no doubt as a less than subtle means of trolling the discovery claims of Columbus, this Viking replica ship sailed from Norway to Chicago. And such had in fact been the plans for the Columbus replicas, but those plans in the end needed to be revised. And perhaps even more than the purported portraits of Columbus, his flagship Santa Maria became the most readily recognizable emblem associated with the Exposition, appearing on many coins, medals, tokens, postage stamps, and numerous examples of ephemera. All of these images of Santa Maria, however, were at best just conjecture, as no one then or even today really has a clear notion of what the ship looked like, or even what type of late 15th century ship it might have actually been. Already in anticipation of the 400th anniversary, the Spanish naval officer and nautical historian Caicerio Fernandez Duro had poured through archives, contemporary illustrations, and other material to offer his best solution for the construction, hull type, and rigging plan of Columbus's ships in a number of publications, which then served as the basis for the construction of the replica of Santa Maria, funded by the Spanish crown. This replica would recreate Columbus's voyage on its way to the Chicago Exposition. And perhaps as a way to mollify ever-growing tensions with Spain, which of course culminated in 1898 in the Spanish-American War, just a few years after the Exposition had closed, Congress appropriated funding for replicas of Nina and Pinta to be built in Spain, which would then sail to the US along with the Santa Maria replica. However, with only a few months left to build the additional replicas, it was decided to convert two existing small coastal vessels into the Nina and Pinta, both of which proved to be so unseaworthy that they had to be towed across the Atlantic by US Navy ships. In the end, all three replicas participated in the New York Naval Review, eliciting a great deal of comment before making their way to Chicago. Long after the White City was knocked down, all three replicas lingered on before finally sinking at their moorings decades later. And it was Santa Maria alone that was raised and restored before finally falling to pieces in the 1950s, a testament to how well built the replica was, regardless of how accurate it might or might not have been. I'd like to close by fast forwarding 100 years to 1992 and the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first crossing. Again, there was a great deal of media and numismatic attention paid to the anniversary, which resulted in a number of commemorative coins and medals being struck for the occasion, including those by the US Mint, which paid homage to St. Gaudens's award medal obverse, and of course, featuring the Santa Maria on the reverse. In addition, there were a couple of feature-length films. Overall, however, there was decidedly a great deal less enthusiasm for celebrating Columbus or his doings in 1992 compared to 1892, which came as a surprise to many, including those at the American Numismatic Society. As we had in 1892, the Society once again commissioned a medal to celebrate the anniversary and had over 600 copies struck in anticipation of brisk sales. To this day, however, we still have hundreds of these left unsold in our vaults, a reflection, no doubt, of changing views of Columbus and what he means to us now, 530 years later. Thank you. Let's stop sharing that. Any questions?
Yes. Peter?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. One question I had is, to what extent did losing the expo to Chicago help with the push to join the boroughs into New York City?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I don't really recall what the answer to that might be. I seem to recall reading something to the effect, but perhaps somebody else would have an answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah, so the consolidation of Greater New York took place in 1898, which again was just 5 years after the exposition ended. But I know that the discussion about consolidating the boroughs had been taking place for a good while, before that, and so it's hard to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess sort of related I'm sorry if you mentioned at the beginning, the lynchings of 1891 in New Orleans of Italians, was that one of the motivating pushes for honoring Columbus this way?
It's that was already after Congress had set in motion the appropriation and set up the senatorial select committee and so forth for that. So what Larry is referring to is a massacre of Italians, Americans that took place in New Orleans in 1891. So these Italians had been accused of murdering a New Orleans sheriff, if I remember correctly, and they were found guilty, but the local community there just decided to break into the prison and gun them all down. There were, I think, roughly a dozen or so of them. They were, as I recall, there were claims that they were associated with some Sicilian organization, the name of which was new to American vocabulary, this mafia, and so that again sort of helped fuel a lot of anti-Italian sentiment that was already raging by this point, in the 1890s. So
it wasn't guns; it was rope.
Or rope, yeah.
It was the largest lynching in U.S. history.
Right.
That's why we have Columbus Circle.
That's one reason, probably. Yeah.
There's a lot of apologizing. That is why we have that statue in Columbus Circle.
It is directly related to the lynchings, do you think, or is that?
Yeah. Harrison needed to repair the relations with the Italian community and Italy itself.
Right.
And that's one of the, and because of the coincidence of Columbus, the 400th, coming so close to that event, when they were trying to pick which Italian to celebrate, it sort of was an obvious thing.
Right. Very good. Any other questions, comments?
Yes, I do. Oh,
Robert, yeah. Or Bob, go ahead.
Two things. The gilt statue of Edie Phelps Stokes. I read that was dragged out again and re-gilt for 1992. Do you know how that was preserved or where it was kept?
Which statue is that?
Edie Phelps Stokes as the Republic at the end of the pool.
Oh, right. So that the original statue was intended, I think, as one of the more permanent structures. So this is something that
it was only plaster, though. It was gilt plaster.
Could be correct. Yeah, but it lasted for a while afterwards, and then somehow collapsed. And then this 1/3 scale replica was created at some time in the early part of the 20th century, if I recall. And
is that on display anywhere?
Oh yeah, no, it still stands somewhere in Jackson Park in Chicago. It is only 24 feet tall as opposed to 75 or so feet tall. And they refer to it as like Big Mary, or Big Mary, I think is what they nicknamed the statue. I have to say, it's not Daniel Chester French's best work. I mean, it really is sort of an odd looking creation.
I thought it was St. Gaudens.
No, Daniel Chester French.
Oh.
St. Gaudens, the problem, St. Gaudens was already trying to finish the 54th Massachusetts Regiment sculpture, and he had been working on that for the better part of a decade. And part of his contract with the people in Boston and the family was that he could not undertake any other commissions without their permission. And so he, sort of begged and pleaded. And in fact, he had to beg off or beg a bit in order to do the presentation medal commission. But he, was just, his hands were just too full, which is part of the reason why he let Mary Lawrence take over the creation of that.
Was French enamored of Edith Stokes? Certainly St. Gaudens must have been.
Yeah, well.
Given the portrait.
Yeah. No, that's right. I'd forgotten about that connection.
Also, one of your medals, the tokens from the New York end of it, refers to Columbus's flagship as the Maria Santa.
Right.
Is there any evidence that it was ever called that, or is it just a stupid mistake?
No, it's just a stupid mistake. In fact, that same medal also refers to the cruiser New York as the battleship New York.
Oh.
The ship was, an armored cruiser, and it would be years yet before there would be a battleship. So.
In grave in haste, repent at leisure.
That's right. That's right.
Peter, quick question. Were there any celebrations outside of the United States?
Yeah,
like
there were
Spain or Latin America?
Yeah, there were celebrations that took place in Spain as well as in Italy. And in fact, the crew of the USS Newark and USS Bennington, the two ships that towed the Nina and Pinta across the Atlantic, they were participating. In fact, they had been sent to Spain specifically to take part in some of the celebrations in Spain associated with the 400th anniversary. Mm-hmm. And they, thankfully they were there, because as those two replicas turned out to be so unseaworthy, they, at great risk to some of the American crewmen, they had to be then towed across, the Atlantic.
So there's presumably some numismatic tributes in Spain and Italy during that period as well, right?
Yeah, and in fact, there was a lot of numismatic production in Italy. I haven't been able to find as much for Spain, but a fair amount took place in Italy, and some of it associated with local Italian celebrations, but some of it also created specifically for the Chicago Exposition. In fact, there was one medal that was produced in Milan. I think it was Stefano Johnson, associated with Stefano Johnson's operation, that produced a really rather elaborate medal, which again, the editors of AJN had some issue with, although they not as much issue as some of the other. In fact, as I recall, they were concerned that that medal displayed a little bit too much realism and not enough sort of allegory, particularly in the presentation of the bare-breasted Native American princess.
I'd have to look up that medal. Speaking about medals, is the ANS still selling off its group?
Anybody who wants one of those 1992. I mean, in fact, now that we have our eBay store, I think we should just,
throw a couple out there.
Well, or just offer them all at some hefty discount, because they're taking up, column space, and, we need that space. So any of you who want, a 1992, commemorative medal, please, send me an email.
I might do that.
Peter, if I might, I was curious, you mentioned that some foreign countries had exhibitions in Chicago. Did any of them display numismatic material?
I'm sorry?
Did any of the foreign countries that had displays in Chicago show medals?
Well, no, in fact, there had been, that there was that proposal by the ANS to do an exhibit, and there was another proposal by the British to do an exhibit of medals and coins as well, historic as well as contemporary. And in one of the editorials in the AJN, the editors were waiting to see, what the response of the Chicago organizers would be. And I was never able to find, what that response was. I assume that the response was equally negative. In fact, one comment that the editors of AJN made was that they did approve an exhibit of stamps at the Chicago Exposition. And so it seemed that, to their eye, that the Chicago organizers were, stamp collectors and not coin collectors, or, something along those lines. And so, but I've not been able to find anything, having to do with numismatic displays at the Chicago Exposition, which, was, odd to say the least. I mean, considering everything else from, grain to guns to, railroad equipment and even stamps apparently was on display.
Peter, if you ever want to expand your talk to banknote engraving, there's some great engraving done for the fair, particularly the Columbian Exposition diploma, which is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing's proudest product. It's a stunning document. In addition to the tickets done by American Banknote for it, Western Banknote did some engraved invitations and various things. There was quite a bit in the banknote engraving area.
Yeah, and in fact, that certificate that was issued alongside the medals, so the presentation medals were given with this certificate that Mark refers to, and it is a gorgeous piece of engraving.
It's the Bureau's proudest product in its entire history from 1862 to today. It's the grandest document, remarkable. Yeah. And Charles Schlecht, the two people most responsible for the $1 educational note, Will Lowe and Charles Schlecht, are the people who were the primary ones. Lowe was the artist on that certificate, and Schlecht was the primary engraver of the figures. It's remarkable.
No, it really is. It really is. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah,
I think you're right. Should I ever give this again, I'll definitely include all of that material.
I can provide illustrations if you want.
Very good. Yeah.
Peter, there's a question here in the chat. If you could speak to the route that was taken by the Viking ship versus the Columbus replicas, if it was the same route or if they took different paths.
The Viking ship sailed from Bergen in Norway, and I believe that they did take that more northern route towards Newfoundland, which is where Leif Erikson, eventually ended up. And in fact, since the Viking ship actually made its way, through the channels into the Great Lake and so forth, they presumably did take that northern route. The Spanish, the replica of Santa Maria went the southern route into the Caribbean and stopped off in Cuba and Havana before making its way up to New York. And the U.S. Ships, sailed along with them to Havana and then sailed up to New York from there as well. So I guess the answer would be yes. Both sets of replicas did more or less follow the original routes.
Go ahead. I know you said you've been waiting for a question.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, lovely presentation. Thank you very much. Very informative. And always great to learn more about the history of my hometown. I'm not sure if you've been to that part of town when you visited Chicago, but as far as I'm aware, you can enter one of the buildings that was part of the exhibition that reopened in 1933 as the Museum of Science and Industry.
Right, yeah.
Which is along the Midway Plaisance, that's still named the Midway Plaisance, at the other end of which is the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Worth a nice visit to that part of town.
Yeah, no, in fact, the last time I was in Chicago, about 2 years ago, I was there for a meeting at the Oriental Institute. And before that meeting, which was early afternoon, I made a point of going to the Museum of Science and Technology specifically to see the U-boat that they finally moved inside You know, I've got a lot of naval interest, as you can see. You know, was really happy, you know, to visit that again. I hadn't been in Chicago for probably a decade before that, but that building, the Science and Technology Museum, was the art palace during the exhibition, and was really the one of the only structures I think that remains from the 1893 exposition. But it's, you know, it's an impressive building and impressive area. In fact, that whole Plaisance is really quite nice as well.
And it survives from that, you know, over 100 years ago. That's what's left of that great event in the city.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
If I might comment.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on the question about other countries' participation, you mentioned Spain and Italy. The Central American Mint, El Salvador, in 1892, redesigned their silver peso to include the bust of Columbus, which is kind of interesting because the enabling legislation at that time required the flag design. And in 1892, they changed that and they retained the Columbus effigy for over a decade, I guess, till 1914. So there was I don't know if you call it a celebration, but certainly a major currency coinage redesign in at least El Salvador.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I mean, Columbus's popularity in some parts of the world, and obviously in some parts of the U.S., you know, remains. I mean, he still continues to be an important symbol, you know, for many people, a positive symbol. Whereas obviously he's a magnet of iron, you know, contempt for, you know, other parts of the population. And, you know, it is, you know, to me always fascinating how, you know, this sort of symbolism works, you know, how either generation across generation, you know, or diachronically, or, you know, just, you know, geographically, you know, symbolism can change, you know, very quickly. So, yeah, in fact, comment here from Susan Shea about, in the chat about, you know, symbols in southern Utah, saying here, the past year has proven Tainter correct about the persistence of symbols in support of political and cultural legitimacy. Against all odds out here in the upper Mojave, instead of a focus on getting residents vaccinated, there is ongoing furor over a proposed change of a name of the local college to drop Dixie from the name. This has resulted in one piece of public art after another being displayed, removed, and displayed again. Given today's topic, Aunt Jemima and Columbus would have been two of the symbols causing the greatest responses. Yeah, very good. So, yeah, it's, any other questions? Well,
Bob Hogue is muted. He's trying to speak. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
One numismatic note is that the Columbian Exposition witnessed the introduction of elongated coins into the
right
world fraternity.
Yeah, that's one thing that I didn't really touch on at all, but we do have quite a number of these elongated coins as well associated with the exhibit or with the exhibition. Yeah. So,
if I can ask one final question,
sure.
Was that Columbus coin, despite its lack of great success, was that the beginning of the regular issuance of commemoratives by the Mint?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, in fact, once they begin to realize that they could, you know, issue these coins and attach them to some sort of funding purpose, which, you know, still occurs today. I mean, a lot of commemorative coins that are produced by the U.S. Mint are sponsored by various groups and will use funding raised from, you know, the sale of these coins to promote whatever it is they're doing. And so that basically broke that wide open. And, you know, there was a huge surge of commemorative coin production by the U.S. Mint in the early 20th century, which then basically fell off, I guess, around the time of the Second World War, and then, you know, reemerged in the 1980s, 1990s, you know, and it's just continued, you know, unstoppably ever since. So, in fact, a lot of, you know, our work on the Citizens Coinage Advisory Committee is all about, you know, commemorative issues. You know, I mean, we rarely, or I shouldn't say rarely, but at least not that frequently, you know, are dealing with actual circulating coinage, but mostly just, you know, commemorative issues of one sort or another.
Well, thanks for a great talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I once again will thank you all for attending today, and very much look forward to seeing you hopefully this next Friday at our next long table, and if not then perhaps at our next Money Talks. So, and I do encourage all of you to get outside. It seems to be a gorgeous day, at least here in New York. So.
And just as a quick kind of note of announcement, next week's long table will be given by Ute Wartenberg and David Tripp on the kind of the tangle and the drama of the 1933 Double Eagle. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you on Friday and at next month's Money Talks.
Yeah, that'll be a good one. I certainly encourage all of you to attend next Friday. That should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it, certainly. So. All right. Have a good afternoon, y'all.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society. Since 1858, the ANS has supported research and education in numismatics and the history of money. With a collection of over 800,000 objects, an extensive library, a dynamic publishing arm, and ever-improving online research resources, we have become one of the largest numismatic institutions in the world. If you wish to support the ANS and the work we do, you can join as a member and become a part of this historic community. Go to numismatics.org/membership to see options and prices.